Hi, welcome everyone. This is the session called Who's the Boss Now? Building Worker Power in an Age of Apps and Insecure Work. I think we're gonna have more people shuffling in, but to respect our panelists' time, I'm gonna recommend we go ahead and get started. So first I should say that this session is being recorded. And if you have any questions during the panel, so we're gonna reserve about 10 minutes at the end for an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, the box at the bottom. And if you are having any tech challenges or issues, please just say so in the chat and the room host will get you helped out. So my name is Brian Chen. I'm a staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project. It's a nonprofit that advocates for workers' rights. And today we are going to discuss the issue of misclassification, particularly in the app-based economy. This is one of the most pressing issues of economic inequality and worker exploitation of our time. And we really have a wonderful panel with us. I first want to illustrate the problem with a recent story. So recently, a 71-year-old woman in San Diego, she has diabetes. She had recently declared bankruptcy. She needed to earn money, and she had been driving for Uber and Lyft to supplement her pension. And as COVID hit and the state of California announced lockdown orders, she stopped driving for a few weeks. But eventually she tried to apply for state unemployment insurance, but like many ride-hail drivers, she had trouble accessing the benefits because the companies call her an independent contractor, a 1099, and they do not provide wage records to the UI agency. So she needed money, she couldn't get the unemployment benefits, so she decided to start driving again during the pandemic. A few weeks later, after driving, she fell ill with a sore throat. She started coughing, she had a fever, and at the hospital, they diagnosed her with COVID-19. In early July, she eventually died of complications from the coronavirus. And if that story sounds extreme, it is not exceptional. This is an example of one of the most dire consequences of independent contractor misclassification. When a worker fundamentally is performing the core services of a business, but that company unlawfully calls them an independent contractor just to lower their own payroll costs. And that means workers can't access the benefits of employee status. And when people lack protections like paid sick days, it often forces them to make impossible decisions like staying home and not being paid or having to work through a pandemic. So today's discussion is going to focus on solutions to this problem. How do we ensure that workers can access the protections of our labor and employment laws, and they actually have the ability to stand up to their boss and build collective power for themselves? So I am very pleased to introduce our panel today. They are all experts with substantial experience on this issue. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Veena Dubal is a law professor at the University of California, Hastings School of Law. She has extensive experience researching and writing on issues of precarious work, technology, and the law. She has been cited to as an expert by the California Supreme Court, as well as by local and national media. Diego Lorena Quiñones is a New York City-based working cyclist. He's worked previously for companies like Postmates, DoorDash, Caviar, and Uber Rush, both on the streets and as an operations manager for Postmates. He is now the founder and CEO of his own company called Cargo Bike Solutions. Lorena Gonzalez is a California Assembly member representing California's 80th Assembly District in San Diego. She's the author of Assembly Bill 5, a landmark bill in California that clarifies and expands access to worker protections that passed in September 2019 and became effective January 1st, 2020. And Tammy Kim is a freelance writer and New York Times opinion contributor who has written extensively on the labor movement and the gig economy. So I first want to start with the major news this week, really bombshell news. that on Monday, the San Francisco Superior Court ruled that Uber and Lyft must classify their drivers as employees and not independent contractors. And this is a landmark ruling that was made possible by California's Assembly Bill 5. I see some claps by Diego. This was made possible by Assembly Bill 5, which institutes a so-called ABC test in the state's employment laws. So I want to start with you, Lorena. You are the author of AB 5. Can you please tell us, what this bill does, first of all, why it was a priority for you and your constituents, and then if you would, just please give us a reaction to Monday's pretty breathtaking news.
Well, AB 5, as much as, we'd love to say it was our brainchild, it actually came out of a California Supreme Court decision, a bipartisan unanimous decision called Dynamics. And what the justices said, and that basically, I'm breaking it down here, is, we've seen enough of misclassification suits. We've used this standard that was muddled. Workers didn't know what they should be classified as. They couldn't get recourse. Employers use it to cheat workers. So we're done with that. We want to replace that with a much more simple test, an ABC test, one that's been used by other states in different forms for years. And it basically breaks down to, like, if you're doing the work of a company, and the company is exerting control over your work, you're an employee. It's pretty simple. They decided that in April of 2018. And I think that's important because Uber and Lyft have known since 2018, April 2018, that this decision was coming for them. It was very clear. We were talking about delivery drivers, in fact, in Dynamics. It's not even unclear who they were talking about. And we saw that decision, and interestingly, it was the Chamber of Commerce and some companies that came to us and said, this needs to be clarified in law, because the way it was written, it could apply to anyone. It could apply to basically an individual who's working truly as their own company. It applies to every freelancer, and we need some clarifications. Well, we need some clarifications both for workers and for businesses. So that's where AB 5 came in, and it said, yes, we're going to take Dynamics and we're going to codify it into law across all labor laws. So not just wage and hour, but also unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, the whole host of things that California is so proud to be at the vanguard, really, of worker protections. And we're going to try to decipher through it. We're going to go through it using historic definitions, using the actual case of Dynamics and the reasoning in it to decide who is and isn't basically inside AB 5 or the ABC test. And in doing so, we took into account just histories of misclassification. I come out of the labor movement, and so to me, misclassification, we always think of in service work. The vast majority of misclassification comes in things like construction, nail salons, janitorial. We have these historic patterns of companies misclassifying workers to avoid paying them what they deserve and avoid paying into the system. So over the last few years, first with AB 5 and now with follow-up legislation, we've been trying to wade through what is the most substantial change in labor law in California in at least 4 decades. But we clearly meant to include Uber and Lyft and app-based companies in our AB 5 definition. And finally, I think the historic nature of this week was finally a judge had the nerve to say enough, kind of like the Supreme Court justices said, in April of 2018, like, this is enough. You have been on notice. You know what the law is. You're sitting on billions of dollars. You need to reclassify your workers. And so it was quite historic and something that I think a lot of us have been waiting on for a very long time, after years of regulators and government really looking the other way and causing and allowing these companies to blow up. We had a judge who bravely said, no, you got 10 days, fix this.
Yeah, absolutely exciting, overdue news from California's Superior Court. I want to ask the others on the panelists, what does this court ruling signify at this moment, what it means for the gig economy, what it means for the labor movement, even beyond the state of California, what this means about the issue generally? And I'll just open it up to anyone who has thoughts.
I'll just say, as someone who watches litigation and court cases in the economy quite closely, that this to date, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, they have avoided a ruling on the merits, especially for a wage and hour case, because that's where they really don't want to have to pay workers a wage floor overtime. And they've done that through extensive settlements and through arbitration agreements. It has been 8 years in the United States of America that workers have been waiting for a judge to look at how controlled they are in their everyday work, to look at the fact that they are the core business of these companies, and to say you deserve the same protections as as Walmart and McDonald's workers get. And so I think that this ruling is nothing short of breathtaking, brave, and long awaited.
That's well said. Veena, I want to help give the audience an understanding of this issue of misclassification. Certainly, companies who skirt the law, who want to boost their own profits, that's nothing new. Companies who mislabel their workers as independent contractors just to steal their wages, that's nothing new. But what do you think is unique or not about the so-called gig economy and how it uses misclassification?
Yeah, I think that 8 years ago, when journalists and even the public were sort of really excited about Uber and the ability to get a ride at the touch of a button, what they were mesmerized by was really regulatory arbitrage. What they were experiencing was not the result of technology, but essentially a centralized dispatch system that already existed in the taxi industry, but that municipalities hadn't yet adopted across the board for all taxi companies. They were experiencing the centralized dispatch system, and they were doing so in a way that was essentially the companies were operating illegally. They were operating without any regulatory caps, any vehicle caps, any fair regulation. And so if I were to say that there is something, what was most new about what they were experiencing was not, again, the technology in those early years. It was just lawlessness. And the second thing that I would say is that Uber and Lyft and Instacart and all of these companies do invest a lot of money in social scientists and engineers who do these things that seem to be new and endemic to technology and the future of work. What they are doing is essentially indirectly controlling workers in a way, and consumers in a way that is invisible to them. So that is sort of the fancy new part of what these companies are. It is not the service. If you read Black Beauty, there's a whole chapter in Black Beauty about the misclassification or the exploitation of livery workers, of the workers who drove the horses around and picked up people and took them from point A to point B. The service is not new. The centralized dispatch nature of the service is not new. What is new is the way in which these companies are driven by finance capitalism, so by billions of dollars that give them the ability to offer below market prices and below market wages. And the way in which they use engineering feats, the way that they use algorithmic management to make it seem like they're not the employer, but to direct to control their workers. For example, the big lie that the companies have been spewing for 8 years is that this is flexible work. And drivers, particularly drivers who work full-time, and that is the majority of the work that is performed by on these apps is done by full-time drivers. Full-time drivers will tell you that their work is not flexible, that in fact at the beginning of the week they get an alert that tells them essentially what their shifts are. It tells them these are the times when there's actually going to be high demand. And by inference, these are the times that you should work. While they're driving, they get text messages and alerts that tell them, we are going to incentivize you to go to this particular area to do your work. And now if they don't go to those particular areas, they're not going to earn a living because there's no guaranteed wage floor. And so
that's a great point, because this issue of how much control the company has over someone, this issue of how much flexibility does the worker actually have. I mean, I want to ask you this, Diego, because you have worked for companies like Postmates previously. You have done this level of work. I want to ask you, I mean, how much independence did you feel when you were doing this work? How much flexibility did you think that you had?
Well, it's certainly an illusion of flexibility, but you're pretty much locked into these static rhythms that you have no control over. It's not like if, let's say, I was a student or, you know, running another side hustle, like I could just plug in and make the same amount of money at any given point in the day. So it's like, try organizing your life around 11 to 2 and 5 to 9, you know, like that's the whole day. I mean, you get very little breaks in between if you factor in getting into the zone, getting out of the zone. Maybe you want to have something to eat. I don't know, you know, so it's real difficult. And while Veena was speaking, I decided to pull up from my phone. I don't know if you guys can see it, but these are all the notifications that I got from Caviar. I'm still in the system. The last one that I got yesterday at 10 in the morning is, we'll bonus you $4 for every completed delivery accepted in Manhattan between 11 and 1. Hope to see you logged on. The next one is, we expect high demand tonight due to light rain. Get into a hot spot. The next one is, we could use some extra help in Manhattan. Are you available? And so they're just kind of like, come on, I need you, come work, come work. And it's real challenging because every courier is seeing these messages. And so if they are taking these cues, they're then going to saturate the work zones, and then this algorithmic setup that determines who gets work, which is very like opaque. You don't know how it's really operating. We all end up competing for a dwindling supply of work that comes and goes in an instant. And, you know, it's like a game of piñata, you know, It's like we're all hitting the piñata, and then the big kids might get a few good pieces of candy and the rest of us are left, you know, holding straps. So it's real tricky out there. They do a lot of marketing to attract people into the labor pool, as far as like, oh, you can earn 25 plus an hour, work your own schedule. And that's kind of the hook. And then maybe they throw in a couple incentives early on to supplement your earnings based on these very meager commissions. And you are mostly working for tips. And then the tips are just like hit or miss. And most often cases, you know, with contactless delivery now happening more and more, I'm seeing from, you know, conversations with couriers that because the customers don't even have to make contact with the courier, they're not even tipping them. It's like this invisible service of invisible people doing this essential work who don't even get recognized anymore. So it's getting worse.
Tip your delivery people, folks. Tammy, I want to ask you about this what is often called the gig economy, because I think when we hear that, we think, okay, we're talking about the Ubers, we're talking about the Lyfts of the world. You have written previously that the gig economy isn't so much this specific set of companies, but that really this, it almost represents a kind of process of degrading work. Can you tell us about what you mean by that?
Sure, thanks so much. So when I look at the gig economy, I'm thinking about the fact that, of course, some people have always been in a gig economy, like day laborers and domestic workers and other vulnerable people who have never had a sort of standard or traditional employment relationship. And I'm also thinking about the fact that in the early 20th century, when unions and our sort of regulatory framework wasn't in place, pretty much everyone in the economy in the West, in the US, was kind of a gig worker, right? Because there weren't sort of regulated relationships where you could depend on having a steady employer. Everything was kind of haphazard. So in a way, this is kind of harkening back to that moment historically. And I think what Veena was describing and Lorena have described as, you know, the sort of Uber and Lyft's basically like ideological resistance to any sort of state regulation is part of that and reflects a view in which corporations think I can do whatever I want and the state will catch up with me. And if I call this innovation, I can basically say, well, it's not us that's the problem, it's actually the state that's the problem. So, I think that kind of thinking about, the gig economy and the rhetoric of gigs and freedom as a kind of ruse on all of us, we're being played basically by this sort of a philosophy that degrades work and that looks at it as completely interchangeable is really important. And I think it's also, as I've been a freelance writer for 2.5 years, and I can see the ways in which Uber and Lyft and that kind of model of translating gig work through platforms hasn't remained limited to delivery and logistics, but has gone into all sorts of different areas. So, in cleaning to, freelance writing to hotel work. And so it's basically, as you said, a process of changing employment relationships in every sector, as opposed to something that exists only within certain named corporations.
Thanks, Tammy. And you brought up this point that historically, and certainly now, the Ubers and Lyfts really want to do everything that they can to resist state regulation. There may even be some change in that. I mean, I want to ask you all about this point that earlier this week, on the same day that the judge in California ordered his company to reclassify their drivers as employees, the CEO of Uber wrote in the New York Times op-ed, and he agreed that gig workers have it hard and that we need to do more to protect them. And he proposed a kind of what he called a third way of worker classification. So not quite an employee, more than an independent contractor. He claims this would preserve the flexibility that workers of his love. I mean, I just want to ask you all, what do you make of that idea that there's this third way? I see a lot of hands. I think I saw Lorena first.
It's first of all, it's disingenuous. I think that you're seeing now what we've been hearing. I think I heard it over the last year. They wanted a third way rather than to adopt our traditional standards of employment. And I'd ask Uber, I asked Tony Weston, what part of our benefits now do you not want to provide? Which one is outdated? Is it your contribution to Social Security? Because they refuse to do that. That's 7.5% contribution to Social Security and Medicare that the company is liable for and is not currently paid. Nothing they're suggesting ever gets to that 7.5%. So they want portable benefits, but they don't even want to start paying into the one portable benefit that has been proven to last through decades and provide us a retirement security or some sort of retirement security. I asked them, what about unemployment insurance? Oh no, that's a no-go. We don't want to pay into unemployment insurance. We'd rather go lobby the federal government for a taxpayer giveaway than actually do our part like other companies do into paying into unemployment insurance. Well, what about minimum wage and overtime? Well, we want a minimum wage as long as you don't count all the hours worked, just the hours when you have somebody in your car. So it's really saying we want a third classification of employment that takes away all the protections we've worked so hard to create and to really create like an underclass of employees. And if it's acceptable for Uber, it's going to, as Tammy talked about, all those other jobs that are currently trying to get people through an app to have kind of this flexibility, it's going to be acceptable for that as well. And we're going to create a underclass of employment. And we're going to, as far as they'd like to actually formalize that, in which means the companies get off and the taxpayers pay for the subsidizing of their workforce, which they're just not paying enough into.
Veena?
I couldn't have said it better. And I just want to add one thing, that in the United States, in their largest markets, also in Europe, in their largest markets where they've been pushing this third category of worker for at least since 2016, the people who perform the core part of their work are largely people of color, immigrants, migrants, refugees. They are essentially trying to carve out the poorest, most vulnerable workers in our economy from the protections of the state. We already have that problem already in the United States as a result of racist Southern plantation owners. Agricultural workers and domestic workers do not have the right to collectively organize. This has been one of the biggest problems for the most vulnerable people of color workers in the United States. What they are trying to do is take those same racist ideologies from the early part of the 20th century and reinscribe them into law, grow them so that, again, the most vulnerable people of color workforce do not have the ability to predict their income, do not have the basic protections that every other employee has, and continue to live on the margins of society without any prospect at mobility, at security, at safety for themselves or their families.
Diego, it looked like you wanted to say a word.
Yeah, I mean, so my journey with this work goes back to 2013 when Postmates first came to New York. And at the time, the money was really good. You know, like if you could log onto an app and bank $40 an hour, like I'm not complaining. It was really good at the time. And so in the beginning, everything was exciting. It was new. We were making money. I got brought in as an operations manager, and I started drinking this Kool-Aid on the inside, you know, behind the scenes, and it tasted really good, guys. Like I believed a lot of what I thought we were doing at the time, you know, 2013 into 2015, when Postmates was still kind of an unknown, relatively small service in some markets, but more and more under the pressure to scale these operations at a national level, you know, to go from, you know, a couple hundred deliveries a week, a couple hundred customers using the service, a novelty kind of thing, and a side hustle kind of experience that was good for the worker, to then try to make it this ubiquitous service that everyone was using and really scale up. That's where things, you know, over time started to fall apart. And so it was kind of like a bait and switch, you know. In the beginning, you know, we didn't care about our classification because the cash up front was phenomenal, right? But then what happens? You know, you have these services that increasingly get larger and larger and larger and just want a bigger piece of the pie, and to create these massive infrastructure opportunities that benefit the venture capital that originally sank all this money in. So they're trying to collect. And so what do? They squeeze whatever margins are available. They start laying off a lot of the actual employees in the operations aspects of these companies, where they begin automating everything from onboarding and training to dispatching. And so, you know, what it once was to what it has now become kind of reveals what the plan was all along, you know. And it's really disheartening to know that the couriers who were on the ground those first 3 to 4 years, really building the success that these companies now ride on, you know, they got squeezed out. They could no longer support themselves and their families, and everything that brought us in just, you know, fell to crap. And so, you know, it's really messed up, you know, and you got a lot of people out there struggling to get by. And everybody at this point is on multiple apps. So it's not even like you can just go on one app and expect to make a decent living. Everybody's multi-platforming on everything they can get their hands on.
I want to ask about how this issue should be viewed, especially during our age of the pandemic and COVID, and as we're all, as most of society understands that there's this essential work that is being performed. Yet we have seen a wave of strikes, of work slowdowns by workers who work for Postmates, who worked for Shipt, Target's Shipt, Instacart. And it does seem that there is something about the pandemic, about COVID, that has really opened people's eyes. I mean, maybe I'll start with Tammy. What do you make of that? What is it about COVID that is so uniquely making people understand this issue more acutely?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a bit ironic because, as Diego pointed out, you know, the COVID has made it so much clearer that there are low-wage workers who are in the supply chain to bring us things that we need in our lives. And as people are trapped in their homes, they're realizing, oh, I need this person to actually shuttle my groceries. I need this person to take me to the hospital or a doctor's office. Yet at the same time, the kind of abstraction of the gig economy through these apps has allowed for a little bit of a disembodiment, you know, a kind of alienation from that as well. So, you know, as Diego was saying, that provides a situation in which you can realize, oh yeah, there is this person who is depending on this delivery to feed their own family, and yet I can get away with not tipping them. So to me, you know, the discussion around essential work and gig workers has both been extremely kind of inspiring, that gig workers are rising up and kind of laying claim to, you know, their importance in this society, but also that as consumers, there's a kind of like dissonance in people's minds about, on the one hand, being forced to acknowledge low wage labor, and on the other hand, still sort of taking it for granted.
Yeah, and you bring up that low wage labor, and I'm struck. I want to ask Lorena, now that the judge is saying you're going to have to reclassify all your workers, your drivers, and you're going to have to pay them a fair wage, Uber and Lyft have publicly said it's not going to be possible. We're just going to leave the state of California, essentially saying, if you make us pay a fair wage and all these benefits, it's just not a sustainable business model. How should we think about that kind of issue?
And we need to take that in context with their ballot initiative to undo the law. So if we allow huge corporations to spend their money to basically threaten the public, we've made you dependent on us. We've done it on the backs of workers. And if you don't agree to this, if you don't agree to changing your laws for these workers, we'll no longer provide it. What Uber and Lyft has done is they've capitalized on the market, monopolized the market so that there is no other possibility of people coming through. They've devastated taxi cabs, which once we relied on, not so long ago, we did have the ability to get a ride somewhere. Beyond public transportation. They've tried to disrupt public transportation. They're attempting to. Obviously, the ridership is down as well. So I think it's dangerous. And when we look at the future of what happens and their threats, which they've employed in other places, I think we have to look at what does that mean for the future of all of our work and for all of our workers if we're really going to allow these billion-dollar corporations, which, by the way, never got to where they are in some kind of free market system, right? They were backed up by venture capitalists. It's not they misused, if you will. I guess misused isn't, I'm not an economist, but they manipulated the market to get the market share, and then come and say, we're going to destroy all your labor laws unless you allow us to operate, or we'll pull out now that you rely on us. This is the system of what they're doing, and it should scare us all. You know, we know that their plans are to get rid of public transportation. We know that their plans were to get rid of the taxi industry and leave us with no other option but to say, oh yes, we need them. And so we're going to give up decades of labor law advances, everything from minimum wage. We haven't even got into paid family leave and SDI and all these programs that we've fought so hard for, anti-discrimination and harassment, some sort of security. Their demands include not allowing us to have real background checks of the workers who are, you know, whose cars we're going into. So I think it for me, it scares me on what we could be seeing in the future. And if we want that type of future, just because a company has enough money to do that.
Absolutely. And Diego, I want to get your thoughts on, you don't live in California. This would not specifically affect you, but let's say that same kind of thing happened in New York City, and they said, if we have to treat these workers as employees, we're just going to leave. I mean, how would you take that when you were working for those kinds of companies like Postmates, if they made that threat to leave?
If they made the threat to leave New York while everyone was working, I think that would do one of two things. I mean, it would put us in a short-term bind because, like, we access these apps to make money right away. But I think New York is an interesting place because you have a lot of people that have been messengers for decades. You do have a community. You do have, you know, a lot of people that have been doing this for a very long time. And I think it would open up the space for smaller outfits to get a foothold. I think what's happened in the last 10 years is that you've had a lot of local companies get, muscled out. Zipments used to be a really popular service in New York City, and people were making good money, and it was relatively small, and then they got bought up by one of the larger tech companies. You've had a lot of rise and fall of, small and medium outfits. Now with these companies, in the city, it's very hard to compete. They basically have monopolies. So on the one hand, from the worker side, it would be a real shock to like lose that access. But I think if they did pull out, we're creative. I think a lot of people would step in. I think a lot of restaurants would come together and figure out a way to replace the services. I can't tell you how many restaurant owners that I've been talking to over time absolutely hate the monopoly that these platforms have, whether it's, Grubhub, and they take like 30% of revenue. DoorDash, I think it's a flat rate of like $30 per delivery on large order. Like, they take a lot of money out of the restaurants, and then they don't really provide a lot of quality service on the back end. So it would mean a transition period, but they want to leave, they can leave. we'll figure it out.
It's a great point, because I think these companies like to pretend they're the only ones who can be innovative. They're the only ones who can create new things. And it's the workers who have this experience who they can bring some innovation to the table as well.
They need us way more than we need them. And all they really did was code some software. We can do that.
Veena, I want to ask you, so we've been talking about reclassification. We've been talking about better laws and policies that can help folks who are misclassified. That by itself may not build worker power. What builds worker power really is organizing, workers talking to one another. And that is the kind of thing that, back in the day, it might have happened on the shop floor. In the gig economy, that isn't quite the case. People are a bit more isolated from one another. How have you seen workers get organized and start to really stand up and build power for themselves?
Yes. So this is what I study. I study drivers that self-organize themselves in this economy. And what I have seen, from 2012 to today has really been transformative. It started that people were talking to one another in cafes, trying in their own sort of groups of friends to talk to one another over WhatsApp, and that was sort of the water cooler. And today, the Rideshare Drivers United, which started as a group of self-organized drivers, have grown themselves using traditional organizing techniques. So rather than just mobilizing workers, what Jane McAlevey calls mobilizing workers through social media, etc., they are actually forming one-on-one relationships with one another, the same way that you would if you were in a factory floor over the water cooler, and they're doing that using technology. So they use an app to organize calls with other drivers, and they have their lead organizers, volunteers have these really meaningful, in-depth conversations with workers across the industry about what it's like, what are their troubles, what are their problems, and it is through these one-on-one, hard, time-consuming conversations that they have built a powerful base that was able to be a driving force behind the support for AB5, that is now being a driving force around the fight to fight this, horrible proposition in California, Prop 22, and that is giving drivers, I think throughout California and maybe even throughout the world, hope for a better future that involves, collective power against the most nefarious, most wealthy, most sort of ill-begotten companies that are around today.
Thank you so much. And I want to think about the nuance of how specific workers are situated in this issue of classification, employee versus independent contractor. Tammy, you work as a freelance writer. I am not ignorant of the fact that freelance writers have been, at least in California, some of the most vocal critics, and they've made arguments that We don't want to be called employees. We like our independence. I mean, how do you see this issue from your vantage point as a freelance writer?
Yeah, I think this has been a really tricky part of the AB5 conversation, as Lorena knows. So for folks who may not know, basically AB5, in codifying that Dynamex decision, the court decision that Lorena described, set up a situation that was best, I think, at targeting corporations like Uber and Lyft, who sort of have personified the gig economy and very cynically used what freelancing and freedom means. But there are a lot of workers like freelance writers and other sort of like creative class people who are in independent contracting relationships with various organizations, and they basically said, hey, you know, we actually like this, or, you know, the numerical quota that would determine whether we're independent contractors or actual employees, this isn't quite right for our industry. And so I know Lorena and other legislators have responded to that by drafting a couple of amendment bills that would tweak AB5, but keep in place the thrust of it, which is really to get at the most cynical bad actors in the system. I think it's a time, I mean, we keep using this cliche of reckoning during the pandemic and during the Trump era, but I think this is real in my industry, which is primarily journalism. You know, we talk about it being a collapsing industry, an industry that I think in the language of like labor economists is like a fissured workplace, like a workplace in which a lot of jobs that were, you know, traditional jobs have now been split up, chopped up into freelancer relationships. And that's a reality that we've been trying to respond to through newsroom organizing. I've been pretty active in journalism organizing into unions and in other bodies to try to gain power. But I say all this just to say that I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about how to deal with freelance relationships in industries where we haven't quite figured out what it would mean for people to regain an employment relationship that seems to now be completely gone. You know, that in freelance writing and other sorts of creative fields, there isn't a lot of money, you know, and things just look very different than they did 50, 60 years ago, where we were already sort of complaining about the death of journalism, you know. And so I think this has been a real challenge, but I would just caution people like me, freelancers in creative fields, to not be used as a weapon against gig workers who are much more vulnerable, you know, especially drivers, Instacart, you know, workers, even care workers in the gig economy.
Thank you. That's a great point. I am cognizant that this is Netroots. It's an election year. Let's say in 2021, we have a new federal administration. What do you hope they do around this issue of misclassification of workers who have been denied their bedrock labor rights and protections? And I'll open up to anyone. Lorena.
You know, it's interesting because when I was hearing Tammy speak, I think one of the things we kind of grappled with freelance writers, for example, we had a lot of exploited, even journalists, you know, from places like Vox, who had taken this model and really magnified it to a way that it was unsustainable for people who were spending all their time trying to write and make a living. And we were trying to figure out how do we kind of create a balance between that, or newsrooms that use the freelance model to best organizing, and that was happening as well. As union organizing was happening, we saw the abuse of freelancers, and so it has been challenging. And the most challenging has been that California can create a lot of laws, but work that can be done anywhere. And that includes writing, right? They don't have to use Californians. So if we create a law, it doesn't protect, it allows companies to go hire from other states. That's a reality. So we really do need federal laws with basic protections. And I think writing is one of those in particular that we need to focus on. Academia, creativity. This is, you know, online tutoring services, all of these things that, yes, they can be done anywhere, if you will, in the United States. but if we don't have some basic national labor protections, we're just going to have a race to the bottom as states start to assert themselves. So for me, you know, obviously I'm supportive of the PRO Act. I'm supportive of making sure we nationalize our labor protections. So much of what California, and to a lesser degree, I think New York has done, is we've been on the forefront of labor protections, but it does create this ability of people like Uber and Lyft to say, well, we'll just leave California. Well, we'll just leave New York City. Well, we'll leave Seattle. Well, we'll leave Austin, you know, any place that has it. So we really need that national focus on labor law.
Okay, bye.
Veena, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that one of the most perverse realities right now in this country is that people who are in the gig economy, low-wage workers who are misclassified as independent contractors, or even freelance writers who are properly classified as independent contractors, if they organize together, can be accused of price fixing under the National Labor, or under the Sherman Act, but as a result of independent contractors being carved out of the National Labor Relations Act. And so I think the most important thing that I would like to see, and the Republicans are already really attacking the PRO Act, which would adopt the ABC test for the National Labor Relations Act, which gives workers in this country the right to organize for safe and fair working conditions. I think that this is what we really have to push in, you know, in the event that we do get a Democratic administration and maybe even a majority Democratic Congress. That is the modernization of the workplace that we need to see in federal law.
We're almost running out of time, but I want to ask, one of the great talking points around the gig economy and about the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world is that this is a new type of work. It is the future of work. It fundamentally looks different, and we need to regulate it in a different way. I don't want to ask any of you necessarily what's wrong with that. I want to ask a different question, and maybe this can be our concluding point. If there's going to be a future of work, and it looks like COVID is a real crossroads moment in terms of what we can make our labor laws, how we can best support our underpaid and vulnerable workers, what do you want that future of work to look like?
I'll start just briefly, and I'll end here and allow others. There is one thing that I think is correct when we have this discussion, and that is your healthcare shouldn't be tied to your employment. That is the one point I'll concede completely. I am a supporter of single payer. I think that healthcare is right. Everybody should have it. One of the things, though, that's wrong when we're talking about the future of work is we don't talk about the future of workers. And so, you know, as somebody who comes out of the labor movement, I think all work is dignified, that there should be basic protections, that, you know, if you work 40 hours a week, that you shouldn't have to rely on public services. You know, you should be able to put food on your table and have housing and put away a little bit for retirement. And so I'm hopeful that as we look post-COVID, that we center the future of work around the future of workers. And I think if we don't start with that kind of lens, that we're going to lead ourselves to favoring the needs and wants of venture capitalists and big corporations, and you know, allowing, I guess we could go all the way down, allowing mom and pops to treat workers the same way big corporations are. None of that is good for the worker, and that's what I'd like to see discussed. And if we start talking about the worker, then maybe we have realistic discussions about 40 hours being too long of a work week. Maybe we have realistic discussions about the safety net not being tied to employment, but those basic human rights, the basic human rights of having a dignified workplace, your work mattering enough to get a minimum wage and overtime and protections in the workplace. I think we have to start there.
I love doing courier work. I really do. I mean, I found it kind of by accident, and it would be a beautiful thing if in the future I could show up and perform my duties to the best of my ability and not feel stress over like, oh my God, am I going to make enough money? Am I going to get enough work? I think absolutely removing healthcare from the equation is a must. I think the gains of our increasingly automated economy and the vast creation of wealth should somehow result in a basic income on every level for every person living in the country, so that, you know, we just, it's almost like we are shareholders in this growing economy. I believe that framing is spot on. And I think that, you know, we have to really look at this new class of overlords, right? The venture capitals who are pulling the strings. It's like the whole economy is bending over backwards to make sure that they just keep getting more and more money, and they're squeezing the margins from the very people that are generating the wealth. And so moving away towards something that really does, like you said, center around the worker, the backbone of everything that makes this economy go, that would be a really good place to start.
Veena, I'm going to give you the
Yeah.
last word.
Yeah, I would just echo both of those things and say that the one thing that I am most afraid of that we cannot move towards in the future of work or for the future of workers is we cannot move towards a piecework economy. And that is essentially what all of these companies are trying to do. They're trying to make it so that workers are paid by the piece as opposed to for all the time they spend laboring. So in addition to disentangling our basic social safety net from employment, I think that people and workers should continue to be, and maybe you know, with higher wages, continue to be to have their income tied to the amount of time that they spend laboring.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank all our panelists so much. I know I appreciated this conversation. I know our audience did as well. So to everyone who joined us, thank you so much. Please enjoy the other sessions today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian, for
Thank
all
you.
your organizing.
Thank you, everyone, for all the work you do. This was great. It was an honor to be in the company of such titans.
You guys are
Likewise.
champions.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.